Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Thomas was in his office reviewing architectural blueprints when his phone vibrated on the desk. An unknown number flashed on the screen, and for a second he thought about ignoring it. Over the past 5 years, he'd learned that unexpected calls rarely brought good news. But something made him answer. The voice on the other end was far too familiar, laced with a hesitation he hadn't heard in a long time. "Thomas? It's Melissa. I know you don't want to talk to me, but you need to listen. It's about that night. There are things you don't know." He felt the air rush out of his lungs. Melissa. His ex-wife. The woman he'd caught in an intimate situation with Greg, his former business partner. The woman who had shattered 8 years of marriage on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, when Thomas had decided to leave work early to surprise her with flowers. The surprise had been his instead. The image still burned in his memory like a live ember, the two of them clearly involved in something they shouldn't have been, in the bedroom he himself had decorated, the panicked look on her face, Greg's nervous laugh trying to joke his way out of it. "I have nothing to say to you," Thomas replied, his voice more controlled than he'd expected. "I get it. But this isn't about us. It's about Greg. About what he did. Please, just give me half an hour. A public cafe, wherever you want. After that, I promise I'll never bother you again." There was something different in her tone. It wasn't the performative remorse she'd shown during the divorce. It was fear. Thomas knew her voice well enough to recognize when Melissa was genuinely scared. Against his better judgment, he agreed. 2 days later, Thomas walked into the cafe he'd suggested, a busy spot downtown where he felt safe surrounded by people. Melissa was already there, sitting in a corner, nervously stirring a cup of tea that looked untouched. She looked up when she saw him, and Thomas immediately noticed the changes. Her hair was shorter, dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she'd grown thin in a way that didn't suit the woman he'd known. She looked like she'd aged 10 years, not 5. "Thank you for coming," she said as he sat down, keeping the table as a barrier between them. "I wasn't sure you'd show up. You've got 30 minutes. Talk." Melissa took a deep breath, her fingers clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. "That night, when you caught us, there were recording devices installed in the bedroom without our consent." Thomas frowned. "What?" Greg had set up hidden surveillance equipment. "Not just in our bedroom. In several bedrooms. In several houses." She pulled an envelope from her bag and slid it across the table. "He blackmailed me for 4 years with that recording, Thomas. Even after the divorce, he kept hounding me, demanding money. It wasn't just an affair. It was the start of a nightmare." Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. Inside were printouts of emails, bank statements, and something that made his stomach churn, screenshots of private images obtained illegally. He recognized the bedroom immediately. It was theirs. The angle showed the device had been placed in a strategic spot in the room. "He recorded everything without consent," Melissa went on, her voice breaking. "Then he told me that if I ended things with him, he'd send the video to you, to my parents, to my workplace. He wanted money. A lot of money. I paid everything I had, Thomas. All my savings. And when it ran out, he demanded more." Thomas looked up from the papers, processing the information. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you go to the police?" "Because I was ashamed. At first it was consensual, it was my terrible choice to betray you. How could I explain it later turned into blackmail? Who would have believed me?" Tears streamed down her face. "And Greg made it clear that if I said anything, he'd completely destroy my life. He knew people, Thomas. He had connections. I was terrified." Thomas flipped through the documents. Transfers of significant amounts from Melissa's account to an offshore account. Vague but threatening emails. And then he saw something that made his blood run cold: other names. Other women. Other accounts. He did this to other people? Melissa nodded. At least 6 I could identify. All married. All clients from the gym where he worked weekends as a personal trainer. He'd seduce these women, install hidden devices in their homes when invited over for dinner or parties, record the encounters, and then blackmail them. Some paid for years. One of them suffered a serious emotional breakdown and needed long-term specialized treatment. Reality began to rearrange itself in Thomas's mind like pieces of a sinister puzzle. Greg. His business partner for 5 years. The guy he'd considered a friend, who'd come to barbecues at his house, who'd been best man at another mutual friend's wedding. A meticulous predator operating right under everyone's noses. Why are you telling me this now? After 5 years? Because he's doing it again. I saw one of the women he's targeting, and she has no idea of the danger she's in. If no one steps in now, something much worse could happen. And because, she paused, wiping tears away with the back of her hand. Because I can't carry this alone anymore. I destroyed our marriage, I know that. But he destroyed my whole life. And he'll keep destroying others unless someone stops him. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Anger, disgust, sadness, and a strange sense of validation swirled inside him. For 5 years, he'd blamed himself for not being enough, for missing the signs, for trusting blindly. Now he was learning there were entire layers of manipulation he'd never imagined. Do you have solid proof of all this? I have copies of everything. Emails I recovered from his computer when we were still seeing each other. Recordings of conversations where he made threats. Testimonies from 2 other victims who agreed to speak if there's legal protection. Melissa pushed a flash drive across the table. It's all here. I've spoken to a lawyer who specializes in cyber crimes. He said we have a case, but we need more people willing to testify. And we need someone Greg respects, someone credible, to take the first step. And you think I'm that person? You were his partner. You know how he operates in business. You have a clean reputation in the community. If you get involved, other victims will feel safe coming forward. Please, Thomas. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm just asking you to help stop him from doing this to more people. Thomas fell silent for a long moment, watching the woman across from him. Part of him wanted to get up and walk away, leave this nightmare in the past where it belonged. But another part, the part that had chosen architecture because he believed in building solid, lasting things, couldn't ignore the chance to dismantle the rotten structure Greg had erected. I need to verify this information. Talk to the other victims. And I'm taking this to the police the right way, with lawyers, with proper protocol. I don't want anything that could be used against us later. Melissa nodded vigorously. I understand. Do whatever you need to. Just, thank you for listening. Thomas picked up the flash drive and the envelope, rising from his chair. He looked at her one last time, trying to reconcile the broken woman in front of him with the wife he thought he'd known. One thing, Melissa. That night, when I came home, you looked happy. That's what haunted me. I couldn't understand how someone I loved could seem so calm in that situation. She bit her lip, more tears welling up. At first it wasn't an act. It was seduction, attention, everything I was wrongly seeking outside our marriage. The blackmail only started later. But that doesn't change the fact that I made terrible choices. I betrayed you. That's true, and I'll carry that guilt forever. What Greg did afterward doesn't erase what I did first. Thomas nodded and left the cafe without looking back. In the days that followed, he dug into the evidence with help from a lawyer specializing in digital crimes. The proof was devastating. Greg had installed recording devices in at least 9 different homes over 6 years. Some of the recordings captured private, intimate moments, filmed without the residents' knowledge, when Greg visited as a social guest. Thomas reached out to two of the other victims. The first, a doctor named Patricia, started crying on the phone as soon as he mentioned Greg's name. The second, Lauren, a corporate lawyer, fell silent for a long moment before asking if he had proof. When Thomas confirmed it, she simply said, "I'll testify." He needs to be held accountable for what he did. It took 3 weeks to build a solid case. Thomas worked directly with a detective from the Cybercrimes Division, who was visibly disturbed by the scale of Greg's operation. Search warrants were obtained. Greg's house was searched, and they found not only the recording equipment but also an extensive digital archive, meticulously organized by victims' names, with payment amounts clearly noted. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning at the gym where Greg worked. Thomas wasn't there, but he saw it on the news. Watching Greg's face on TV, handcuffed and being led into a police vehicle, stirred a strange feeling. It wasn't exactly satisfaction. It was more like closing an open wound he hadn't realized was still bleeding. The trial moved quickly by the system's standards. With so much evidence and multiple witnesses, Greg's defense had few cards to play. He tried claiming the women were willing accomplices and that the payments were gifts for personal training services. But when Patricia took the stand and calmly described how Greg had financially coerced her using illegally obtained private images, the jury seemed to make up their minds right then and there. Melissa testified too. Thomas watched from the back of the courtroom as she described 4 years of extortion, panic attacks, and desperate attempts to raise money without raising suspicion. She avoided looking in Thomas's direction throughout her testimony. When she finished, she quickly left the courtroom, and Thomas never saw her in person again. Greg was sentenced to 15 years in prison for extortion, invasion of privacy, non-consensual intimate exposure, and a host of other charges. His victims received court-ordered restitution, though the money meant little compared to the trauma he'd caused. The architecture firm Thomas and Greg had shared was officially dissolved, and Thomas opened his own practice under a new name, with a changed perspective on trust. 8 months after the trial, Thomas was in his new office when he received a letter in the mail. There was no return address, but he recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Melissa. "Thomas, I don't expect a reply and won't contact you again. I just wanted you to know I'm in therapy and finally processing everything that happened. I've moved to a new city and started over. What I did to you was unforgivable, and what Greg did to me afterward doesn't change that. But thanks to you, he won't destroy anyone else. You turned the worst thing that ever happened to us into justice for people who never had a voice. That says more about who you are than anything that happened between us. I hope you find real happiness. You deserve it. M." Thomas carefully folded the letter and put it in a drawer. He didn't know if he'd ever respond or if he'd simply let those words exist as a strange, asymmetrical full stop to a chapter he'd thought closed 5 years earlier. 3 months later, at an art exhibition where he was presenting an architectural project for a new museum, Thomas met Olivia. She was a curator, with a smile that lit up entire rooms and a way of talking about art that made even the most abstract pieces feel accessible. They talked for hours that night, about architecture and art, about how both of them tried to create beauty amid the chaos of the world. When Olivia asked about past relationships during one of their early serious conversations, Thomas told her the truth. Not all the sordid details, but enough: the betrayal, the later discovery of the blackmail, the trial. He expected to see pity or discomfort on her face. Instead, Olivia took his hand and said, "You took the worst experience of your life and turned it into protection for other people. That's incredible." In that moment, Thomas realized he was ready. Not to forget what had happened, some things stay with you forever, but to build something new on the ruins of what had been destroyed. He'd spent 5 years rebuilding his life brick by brick, and now he finally felt the foundation was solid enough to support a fresh start. On a Saturday afternoon, almost a year after Melissa's unexpected call, Thomas was in the park with Olivia, watching families picnic and children run between the trees. His phone buzzed with a notification. It was a newspaper article Patricia, the doctor who'd testified at the trial, had shared in a support group for victims of cybercrimes. The article was about how digital privacy laws in the state were being strengthened, specifically citing Greg's case as the catalyst for legislative change. Good news? Olivia asked, noticing the small smile on Thomas's face. Something like that, he replied, putting his phone away. Just confirmation that sometimes bad things turn into something useful. Olivia nestled against his shoulder. You talk about those bad things like they're abstract. But I know they cost you pieces of yourself. They did, Thomas admitted. But I've discovered I have more pieces than I thought. And some new ones have grown where the old ones were torn away. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun begin to set behind the buildings. Thomas briefly thought of Melissa, of Greg, of all the lives knotted together in that dark story. He didn't feel hatred anymore. He didn't feel love or special forgiveness either. He felt something closer to closure, that kind of peace that comes from doing the right thing, not because it's easy or satisfying, but because it's necessary. Greg was still in prison and would be for many years. His victims were at various stages of healing, some further along than others. Melissa was somewhere rebuilding her life, carrying her own burden of guilt and trauma. And Thomas was here, in the park, with a woman who made him laugh for real, planning architectural projects that would leave positive marks on the city, living a life he'd never imagined possible on that devastating afternoon 5 years ago. He'd learned that justice doesn't erase pain, but it offers something equally valuable, the certainty that evil has been named, confronted, and contained. And sometimes, that's enough to let life go on, not the same way, but in a new and unexpectedly solid way. When Thomas and Olivia stood up to leave, he took one last look at the horizon streaked with orange and pink. There was still beauty in the world, even after everything. There were second chances, not in the sense of undoing the past, but in building futures the past can no longer define. And Thomas, an architect by trade and a survivor by necessity, was finally ready to draft the blueprints for that new territory. He didn't know if Melissa would find her own version of peace. He hoped so, not specifically for her sake, but because he believed everyone victimized by Greg deserved the chance to breathe without the weight of shame or fear. As for Greg, Thomas rarely thought of him anymore. The man who'd once been his partner and supposed friend was now just a distant shadow, locked away where he couldn't cause any more harm. The story didn't have a fairy tale ending. There was no dramatic reconciliation or sweeping forgiveness. But it had something better, it had truth, it had just consequences, and it held the renewed possibility that good people, even those deeply wounded, can find paths forward worth walking. And as Thomas walked hand in hand with Olivia toward the parking lot, he realized he didn't need anything more than that. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.